First, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for the honor of asking me with my distinguished fellow panelists. So I'm in religious studies. I'm Catholic and a Zen teacher, and to me, being a Jesuit teacher, teaching and living, I live in one of the residential learning communities, so I really live out the Jesuit way. I'm here on campus. I lead meditation groups on campus. I go to Mass at the Mission Church. So I tell you all of that, although it may not seem to link to Jesuit education, to tell you that what I think it means is to create a home for all parts of ourselves. So our spiritual part, our learning part, our need for the sacred, our need for new learning. There's a quote from Father Nicolas, a former superior general of the Jesuit order, that I've never forgotten. He said that we're not converting our students to Catholicism, we're converting them to humanity. And so that's what a Jesuit education means to me.
Thanks. Thanks for the, I'm going to jump in on before you, Longley. You mentioned Disney. I'm pretty interested in the way that as a corporation, Disney perpetuates itself. If you work for Disney, you need to know the Disney story. There's really a Disney mission, which is very clearly articulated, and it's based in the deep DNA of Walt Disney and his life and his early creations. So I'm very interested in the institutional DNA, how a particular institution reflects the character of its founders and the time in which it was founded. So the Jesuits were founded at the age of discovery, and there was a complete turnaround in how people thought of themselves in the world. With the discovery of or the encounter of cultures, the world was much bigger than the people originally thought. It was also religiously diverse. Within Ignatius's own lifetime, Christianity, European Catholic Christianity, fractured. And at the same time then, even how the cosmos was arranged changed in Ignatius's own lifetime. So what it means, I think, at this point is that this question of discovery is actually one of those key ingredients of Jesuit education. And one of the ways about thinking about this Jesuit education, that it is engendered to allow people to escape from the confines of their own experience up to the present. So beyond zones of comfort. So inventiveness and innovation and imagination are part of what we do. Secondly, and Sarita's already alerted us to this, the Jesuit education was born at the time of the development of Renaissance humanism. Deep respect for the complexity of the human person. But the Renaissance humanists also rediscovered ancient wisdom as well. So I think one of the things that we do is historical perspective is really important, so that we can learn from others' mistakes, but also learn from others' experiences. The Jesuits were set up to do two things, which was really to spread the Catholic faith, but also to contribute to the welfare of society. So there's been a social remit of Jesuit education. So I'd also say then, our education really has an inbuilt ethical imperative, which means choosing. And the choice is never between good and bad. It is always between what is good and better. So there's a kind of a desire to improve all the time. And then finally, Sarita, you talked about education paying attention to all parts of the self. You'll hear whole person everything in Santa Clara. Whole person education, whole person spaghetti. I don't know any way to go, but as a, which means that essentially there is a part of each human life which cannot be reduced to rationality. There is something which escapes our own sense of ourselves as well. So the education, therefore, is person-centered, and our decisions really taken not only the question in what should I do or must I do, but if I take this path, who is the person who I will become, and what will it do to other people as well? So it's always in reference to the person. Thank you.
Just to pick up Father Dorian in terms of choice, for me, I believe that I become my choices, and that the reason why I came to Santa Clara is because my belief in the importance of Jesuit education. For me, what it means is knowing who you are, know how to love, know how to accept love, and know how to live with others, and know how to hope for a better future, the best future. And for me, I try to live it as much as I can. I try to bring that into my teaching, into my research, into my service projects that I do with students. And I love it. I'm not sure what students think sometimes when I embed Jesuit principle in my business courses. But for me, I don't think I have been happier than I've ever been since I've been at Santa Clara. So for me, I'm blessed that I can live with the choices that I have made, and
it's fantastic. Thanks. And I'm hearing themes of the whole person, bringing students or converting students to humanity, but also not just making this about an education of right, wrong principles, but beyond comfort and acknowledging the ethical complexities of our choices. So being that we are in Silicon Valley and we've been, inundated with the news about business leadership in Silicon Valley, how do you think that the Jesuit education speaks to or is related to business leadership?
you want me to jump in a little bit? Okay. I have notes on this one, so.
Good. We don't.
I think, for me, when I think of Jesuit Jesuit spirituality and business leadership or business education, I think of being compatible, but I also see it as intention. And when it's intention, the question is, what wins out? Jesuit values or business profit-oriented? And I think one of the things that I would like for students to think about in my course is what type of person do they want to be and what type of world do they want to live in, particularly as many of them will work in Silicon Valley. And my job is to, in some ways, bring in that reality of, as much as I can, I try to bring in the marginalized community into my classroom. I try to bring in people in the bottom of the pyramid, even though I teach international business and I focus on many of the Silicon Valley companies. I take time to bring these issues in. And I find that what's interesting about our students at Santa Clara is that they have this two type of education at Santa Clara. One is, at least for business students, one is the humanity classes they take. And then when they come to the business school, sometimes they divorce those two things. And what I find is when I start to introduce some of these things, students said, oh, I was in an immersion program at Ignatian Center. And I connect this to this and this and that. And then issues of homelessness in Silicon Valley comes up. The question of how do I think about technology innovation in some ways, and how do I see my work in a corporation in some ways to deal with that type of issues. But I don't want to get off too track, but I'll leave it as there.
Can I? Okay, so I think that Jesuit education at its best is about leadership. I think that's what we do. So whether we're in business or in any other field, I think that's what we should be. We are, and when we are at our best, we are in producing leaders. Now, the question for me is is there any difference between Ignatian leadership and any other kind of leadership? Or is our practice just good practice that we get that you could get in any other business school or any other universities? In certain fields, I mean, the Ignatian and the Jesuit and the Catholic piece really have very little to say. There are no Catholic electronic circuits, so our faith or let's say our convictions really make no difference in certain fields. But where I think they can do is actually in terms of what I talk about: story, style, and substance. I think Ignatian leadership really comes from, is inspired by faith in its roots, but it is also relevant to those who do not share the faith, because it is based on the human person as well. And it is profoundly human, and therefore, because it is based in the human, it is profoundly universal. So I was reading an article yesterday with some of the deans just about what is Ignatian leadership. For me in my job, I mean, I found the question of leadership is it makes me a bit squeamish in some ways because I'm not in a field which is in a management, where there are no techniques that way, and it's something that you pick up in some ways by osmosis. The article suggested, however, that there are certain characteristics of Ignatian leadership, which would be humility. Second would be compassion. The third one is the one that caused most comment, which is the quote for freedom. And freedom in this way means not so much freedom, it's freedom from, but it's also freedom for. It's the freedom to be able to make those good choices in the light of what our own ultimate values, without being conditioned by with sub-values, as it were. One of the founding pieces in the Ignatian charism is the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And within that, one key principle within that is flexibility. So the importance of context, what St. Ignatius called peoples, times, and places. So one holds the principles, but you apply them in a way which is tailored to the actual context there. Which means that the education, or the leadership rather, when as a leader talking to people who one has responsibility for and towards, it always needs to be personalized, but never privatized. It's individual, but it's never individualistic when it has to hold those intentions. So I think in these ways, the leadership piece there, I suspect that in Ignatian and Jesuit education, the distinction actually comes in motivation. Certain things are just going to be, no, that's not kosher, we're not going to do that. We're not going to teach our students to be immoral or be unethical. But I do hope that we're able to show that there is more than being ethical, as I say, that to move beyond the ethics into actually something which is actually, I would say, it's in the terrain of love. In there.
So I'm hearing my distinguished colleagues beautifully present on this particular question. I think I'll focus on the transformation in the students that I work with and how it would relate to this question. And in some cases also my experience leading retreats on campus and leading the meditation groups on campus, a couple of them. So across worldviews, whether they're religious, whether they're not religious, whether they're Catholic, spiritual but not religious, Jain, Sikh, Muslim, etc., what I have found is that at its best, Jesuit education can form leaders from any worldview in the ability to be oriented from a different place. So I teach Zen and I also teach Catholic mysticism. And in that there's this model of ordinary awareness, spiritual awareness, and then connection to your sacred power, whatever that might be, in the middle. And that contemplative practice intersects with social justice and with internal change when you get to the middle, to the center point. So of course, for centering prayer in Catholicism, this is God, but I teach a non-theistic version that is hopefully open to all, and the students choose what their sacred is. So, although I don't have the time to then relate it to the different ways I teach in other classes, the similarity is that then, oriented from this place, their connection to their sacred, and I think that is something Santa Clara University does very well across campus and across disciplines, that then they can be fearless and make choices that their parents might not want. I actually have had students in my classes change careers. That's not actually what they're supposed to be doing. And I have gotten in trouble a couple of times. And choose, for example, a nonprofit or go into teaching when they had been headed to a very different job or something their parents wanted them to do. So I offer that to demonstrate the way in which I think that my hope for Jesuit education in Silicon Valley would be that our students could gain the fearlessness and the knowledge to address the stark moral failures of many of the technology companies in our valley who are not oriented from that center. I'm not sure where they're oriented from, not for me to say, but apparently, hopefully it's not where we're asking our students to be oriented from. So I could go on, as you might imagine, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. One of the reasons that this forum is so dear to my heart is that I lead a class on spirituality and business leadership for our MBA students. And I also teach at the undergraduate and other MBA classes. And one of the things that we talk about is that you have an opportunity to be a leader every moment of every day. People are watching you, and you never know how you will or will not inspire somebody. And a leader isn't about profit, it's about values. So to get to the heart of being a strong leader is to be a values-driven person, a values-driven leader, and recognize the whole person. So these responses definitely resonate with me on what I've seen in my own classroom, where students haven't acknowledged that they may be taking a finance course or a religion course, but really it's about their whole person and who they want to be as a values-driven leader, not about what their profession is or what their bottom line is. And that takes some time. So, building on this, why do you think that Jesuit education, especially for business leadership, is particularly important now?
Have you got about 45 minutes for me to talk non-stop?
Sure, yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, so at the end of September, there was a very big conference in the Vatican organized by the Vatican. It's the second one on technology that they've done this year. Brian Greene from the Markula Center and also Don Hyder were there. One of the keynote speakers on day one was Reid Hoffman, who I think in a somewhat tongue-in-cheek way, know who Reid Hoffman is? So LinkedIn, okay. So, and he said, well, the thing about, you've invited me here, and I should tell you that I'm in the business of making money, you know. So he's a values-driven person, but this is a question of which values, you know. So and in a way, it was a very provocative question, you know, but it was basically saying, so if you want to get into a dialogue with me about values, well, I'll tell you what mine are, you know. So I guess one of the challenges there is that the lack of a common moral currency, and that people can talk about those things, a lack of shared values. I meet around, you know, in receptions and so I meet CEOs, I meet producers of technology who are like just a couple of ranks below. And in many cases, what they will say is that personally they have a faith commitment or a sort of an ethical commitment, but it is always kept private. Because the very nature of the business, the industry itself, is that conversations around values, about what ultimately matters to somebody, are really, really hard to have in a public situation, in a work situation. So in a way, I think what we have ended up there with is sort of where I'm talking about, I guess, when convictions can be easily they remain at the level of being privatized, and they don't really intersect with how a business actually works. I think it is changing because I think some of the crises that is happening in, particularly in social media firms, are realizing, oh, well, actually, there are unforeseen consequences. The last point I want to say here is that one really is probably at the heart of Jesuit education is the value of reflection, which means hitting the pause button and, okay, let's just stop and think about what's going on so that in order where our next action can be more mindful and it can be more impactful, and then we can evaluate it more effectively. The problem about it seems to me, is that the pace of technological change is such that there is not enough time built in for reflection, because reflection itself is antithetical to the business where you're racing to develop the next product to get out ahead of other people. And that's where I think the Jesuit education in that case has a tremendous value, but is a value which may not be lovable by some sectors of technology industries.
Just to pick it up on Father Dorian, I find it's not easy to incorporate Jesuit spirituality in the business courses because sometimes they conflict. And I'll give you an example. Like if you are in the business education, design thinking is in. And design thinking is, how do you understand, have empathy? How do you understand the human experience? Well, when business students or business leaders, when they see design thinking, they're like, I'm going to use empathy to understand the consumer so I can sell more products and services.
Right. Absolutely.
And, what I'm afraid of is, if you don't teach Jesuit values and principles correctly, some students will use it in a way to serve their own interests for their own company. And I think, and for me, it comes down to if you really believe in the Jesuit principle, particularly if you are going to be future business leaders, is you have to think about what is best for the Silicon Valley and not to be the best in the Silicon Valley. And I think, I try to convey that as much as I can to students is how can you be the best for the Silicon Valley? And if you do that, other things may come and it may not. I'm not sure. But if you truly have the freedom to allow the spirituality into your work and detach things that are unimportant, then I think maybe the outcome of our students who will be future leaders in Silicon Valley, maybe things would look differently.
So I have a lot of ambivalence about this particular issue and am a Luddite, so I will say that out loud. But I do have some thoughts. And the first one is that while listening to my fellow distinguished panelists, what popped into my mind was we didn't used to be Silicon Valley, we used to be the Valley of Heart's Delight. And so how then to, that Silicon Valley needs a heart transplant, basically. And how could the Jesuit values aid with that heart transplant? I am actually very pessimistic, I apologize, but I am not pessimistic about the ability of a Jesuit education to shape leaders who could do that. And in terms of then thinking about changes that could be made, what the obstacle for me, even on this panel, and Jennifer and I met and talked about this exact issue, is the commodification of spirituality, and in particular, the commodification of mindfulness. So it's actually, I think, more difficult to commodify the Ignatian exercises, which is good, but it's very easy to commodify mindfulness and use it to make workers more productive, to lessen conflict so that you can fire that HR person that you were hoping to fire, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's the challenge. And whereas the Abrahamic faiths, I think, have not had concrete ties to Silicon Valley businesses, Zen leaders actually have. And I think in part it's because at least Zen itself is more a way of life than a religion. And then also it's cool and trendy, and thus it doesn't appear to be a threat. So lastly, though, my perhaps subversive hope is that then shaping our students as leaders from an Ignatian and Jesuit perspective, and that does not necessarily at all mean that they have to be Catholic, that then they themselves would subvert in their leadership positions. And my personal hope would then be that we could return to the Valley of Heart's Delight as opposed to Silicon Valley as our identifier.
I have a quick question for Father Dorian that I wanted to ask him quite a bit. I know Father Dorian from a number of things we have.
No, I didn't do it.
My question for you is, do you think whether it's Jesuit education or Jesuit spirituality, can it be taught or is it caught?
Oh, that's a really good question, because you're really talking about two parts of the human person. The catching bit would be perhaps the more experiential, the more affective piece. And then taught would be the more intellectual piece. So what I taught you at the beginning was actually some facts about Jesuit education, the history of the DNA and how that affects its way through. I think that can be actually, as a start, that's a way in. You know, we're an intellectual community as a university. I think that's a piece of information. The effective things, and actually I think it was Jennifer who mentioned it, is a question of time and reflection. What I do wonder about this is that in terms of, there may be a question of age and stage appropriateness. For those of you who are undergraduate students, the questions that, the existential questions would be very different from somebody who's in their mid-career. You know? The other question then in terms of our education is that our business school has significant investment in graduate education. And the graduate education experience is always very different, because you don't then, it's largely not residential. You are actually, it's much more in terms of actually skills acquisition. There, I think, it's more difficult to put that in. Jennifer, I don't know if you want to talk about your business and spirituality course and what you've been doing in that.
Well, to piggyback some of the things that have been discussed, and the next where we're going with this conversation, is that one of the things that we offer as the Jesuit School or University of Silicon Valley is the opportunity to reflect at the undergraduate level, at the graduate level, whatever it is. This is a place that's safe to reflect on these issues before getting into those situations. And I always tell people, especially entrepreneurs, time is a luxury. And when you're in the heat of the moment and you're making decisions, you don't have time to reflect on who you are and what your values are. But if you've established that ahead of time, you actually had the opportunity to consider your own foundation, whatever it might be. That gives you a much more solid place to make those decisions. And that is one of the things that we offer as Santa Clara. What do you guys think in terms of Santa Clara and what we have to offer? What do we excel at? This was not a trick question.
I actually had an immediate hit, and I think we excel at humanizing people, movements, ideas that others have told us are inhuman. So immersion programs humanize the unhoused, humanize other areas where perhaps there are gangs, humanize an idea, for example, about a different way to run an economy, et cetera, et cetera. So that is something I see across disciplines and across different units of the university. Certainly, it's often aspirational, but I think that it is something we excel at.
Can I chime in? And I think, again, in conversations that I have, and it's often with an older generation of people, as I meet people, a number of people who are alumni here tell me how really in their Jesuit education at Santa Clara, they've taken it through with the whole of their careers. I'm a theologian, so I'm quite happy to boast that they say it's often their theology and philosophy classes that they've actually carried most forward. So it's made them different kinds of leaders as they've gone on. One ethical theory talks about, it's virtue ethics. And to Jennifer, to piggyback on what you're saying, I think at its best, our education, we talk about it as being transformational, but also formation. So a virtue in this case is something that is a bit like a muscle that you develop by constant practice. So it becomes a second nature. So effectively, when you are in the heat of the moment and you do not have time to sit down and discern and to enter into your Zen position and for the right emergent to say, somehow you have ethical and moral reserves that you can draw on. In there. And I think that is what makes that at its best. I think that's the way it works. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to be out there. So I'm going to say, in terms of Jesuit principle in the business school, I think the business school has a ways to go. I would say that in part, if you believe in Jesuit education in terms of being taught, what tends to happen is when we hire people, we don't ever account whether their values align with Santa Clara mission. We hope that it does, but we never. During the hiring process, Jennifer probably know more than I do, I just assume that it doesn't come up. And if it doesn't come up, it's it likely, there's a reason why the business school doesn't do well in teaching Jesuit principle or integrating the classroom, because we don't hire on those bases. I could be wrong, but that's just my feeling. So I think there's much more that can be done in terms of top down. I think in bottom up, I think it is the responsibility of business educator to allow the spirituality into their teaching. If you're going to be at a Jesuit business school, then you would have to think about it. And I, Andre Debec, who used to be the dean of business school, he would say, you have to give yourself some space and time to think about how to bring that spirituality in the classroom. And we do have activities, not to say that we don't at Santa Clara, for faculty to think about these things, such as the Ignatian Faculty Forum, the orientation when faculty are hired. But most of the part, I don't think it's very structured or very consistent to say to our professor, hey, you need to think about this. But that's just my opinion.
So if I make a comment on that, so one of the I would differentiate there between graduate and undergraduate education, because with undergraduate education we have the core curriculum, we have the core curriculum, we have residential life, we have 4 years generally for most students to spend time with. But time is so precious for a graduate student, and those of you who are in the MBA would get a sense of this, that essentially you are just learning the skills. So the challenge to impart a kind of what would be a distinctive and say this is what makes this place, this is what makes my education different from yours if you went to the Stanford Business School, I think it's actually much harder to do it there. I don't have an easy answer to that about how you would do it within graduate education. Yeah.
Well, that is something that we look at in terms of principled leadership. That is a core part of our business education at the undergraduate and at the MBA level. Ethics are pervasive as a topic of discussion, so it's not as though we haven't discussed that. But we all have challenges. What other challenges do you see for Santa Clara as a whole? Where can we improve?
Across discipline, and I was just fortunate enough to be part of the faculty immersion, and there I met Father Mark Fusco, and he has a love for business and artificial intelligence, and through that conversation and through our time together, we were able to create a co-teaching course based on, it counts as a religious RTC3, where it's design theory, innovation, and Jesuit principles. And so I was fortunate enough to kind of meet somebody who is different, not different, but a Jesuit, and brings, and that really just, that cross-discipline relationship collaboration, I think it could be done better.
I have a fantasy that we would all get more than the 1 hour an academic year for the Mass of the Holy Spirit, where everything is canceled, so there could be meetings or there could be these fruitful times. In our own department, religious studies department, we're struggling to find times to know what each other is doing, to support one another, to reflect. We cannot reflect together because we cannot all be in the same place at the same time together. And the only time in all 30 weeks that the administration tells us this 1 hour you can, well, I'm sure people take naps, or not everyone goes to the Mass of the Holy Spirit, but it is the time where everything is canceled and that is approved. And so I have this fantasy that we would go back to at least once a month, that this 1 hour it's not for teaching, it's not for a meeting, it's not for, and you will get paid for this hour, and it's for your department to learn what the other person is doing, to reflect. We do not get time for reflection. And then the faculty staff retreats are few and far between as well. So I'll stop there.
So I'm thinking back to a speech that Father O'Brien gave in Hakima University. He gave the key in this last summer, which is a fascinating and somewhat scary speech because he provides what you'd expect people to talk about Jesuit education, but he actually then goes into some very challenging language. And really, it's a call to at least to be free to consider the possibility of a radical alternative to Jesuit education. Now, our dirty little secret is that academia is a highly conservative industry. We don't do change very easily, and we like our hierarchies and we like our ranks, and we are slower to adapt than just about any other industry. Am I right or am I right? Yeah.
Wait. Give me a week to think about it.
You got to put it through a committee first.
Oh yeah, and a vote.
So I think for me, the wish list, as it would be, to imagine, can we allow ourselves the freedom to imagine what this might look differently? Now, we are a tuition-driven university, so the money has to actually come in through the front door in order for us to pay salaries and in order to provide an excellent education to our students, particularly the increasing number of students who are going to need significant amounts of financial aid. So in a way, what we're trying to do at the same time is to be an excellent university, because that's what we were set up to do, is to provide an excellent education. I think our task is really to always to question and to ponder and to allow ourselves the freedom to say, well, what is excellence in education anyway, let alone Jesuit education? What does that consist of? What is our industry? What is our end product? And why do we exist? And I go back to that kind of original Ignatian Disneyland piece there, in the DNA. We exist, amongst other things, for the welfare of society. So we have a social remit. And I think that's important not to lose that. So it's not only about producing individuals; it's about the effect that those individuals will have for generations to come. So we're investing in our students, particularly our undergraduates, not only for what they're getting now, but what kind of leader they will be in 40, 50 year times when somebody, she started her own startup and then runs a $1 million business.
Any final thoughts on that one? Okay. Well, I think this would be a great opportunity to open up the floor for questions from you all, from the audience. Are there any questions that you have for our panelists?
Every now and then a question comes up about whether Jesuit values should be included in faculty evaluation, staff evaluation. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Is there a getaway car here I can get into?
So the first thing that pops into my mind is the plight of fixed-term faculty and temporary staff and those who cannot lose their job because of healthcare benefits or for whatever reason, or those who have a 3.5 1-hour commute, or rather one-way commute and a 3.5 hour one-way commute back home. And so unless it is accompanied by training, unless it's accompanied by pilots, and certainly I would welcome that, but not unsupported, and not without some type of investment top down and bottom up. And so I think the most vulnerable among us who statistically are disproportionately impacted by the evaluations would be those who might be left out, hung out to dry. So that is what worries me. I would love for it to happen, but not without a lot of infrastructure, a lot of accountability for those who are training people in the mission, and then some type of appeals process if there has been no training, but the person is fired anyway.
Maybe I should add evaluations administrative.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. Yes, yes.
That's good. You know, it's a really interesting question because in some ways you might argue, well, first of all, if you were going to do that, you'd really need to be very clear about what are Jesuit, what if somebody's going to be evaluated, you know, tell her what she's going to be evaluated on, make it clear to her, and then, you know, give her. But in some ways I would actually argue that they already are, that our faculty are already, because teaching, scholarship and service, if we think about them properly, they are already manifestations of Jesuit values. You know, because that's but I think probably what we need, I would say, there is actually to be able to explain that better, and why is it to be a good teacher is of value within a Jesuit university. Why scholarship itself, just the life of the mind, you know, that kind of that tradition of just what of kind of technically it was called pious learning. The scholarship itself, actually studying what, you know, if you're writing a book on the history of Armenian shoelaces, it's actually a kind of holy act. There's something about discovery, about learning in itself and the search for truth, which is already a Jesuit value. And then certainly service is right at the heart of what we do. So service to one's colleagues, certainly service to one's students, and then service to the wider community. And that would include our wider community would be to the world of Silicon Valley.
I think for me, I probably would not support that. However, I would support something like Ignatian Faculty Forum, where faculty is an invitation, where if you get in it, maybe you get a course off, and there you can engage Jesuit principle or Jesuit education based on where you are at. Because, you know, it's where you're at, and the more that we have those opportunities where we give incentive for faculty to think about, reflect, and give them incentive, whether it's a course off or half a course off or service or a big major service, I think that's probably the way to go.
And Ignatian Faculty Forum has had a huge impact.
Huge.
Yes.
Huge. But I do want to bring it back to Disneyland again in this sense, because it's a cogent example. Because if you work for Disneyland, if you are the lady who puts the invisible ink on your hands so you can go out to the gate and come back in again, you need to know something about the institution, and you probably need to like Mickey Mouse, you know. So there's a sense
Not
in
like Mickey Mouse.
yeah, well, there are people, yeah, so they but I insist that, so it's a question of sort of brand adherence is probably not the right word, but about identification, that there needs to be something within the organization with its whole ethos that you can say, somehow I'm part of this and this is part of me. You know, and that's the ideal to which we're working. And I think that would be true of this university, but also if I was running a company, and God bless the company that I would run, that's what I would want for the people that I work with. You know, that's some of this. We're all in this together, so that the mission, the values, is not imposed, but it's freely espoused because people think it's good. You know?
Thank you. So, hi. The Leavey Business School has an executive center, and that's where I work. So I work in the Silicon Valley Executive Center, which provides executive education to companies that come in, and they get training and formation in various areas. Sometimes it's certification, sometimes it's leadership, sometimes it's basic management. So my question is, what would you advise me and people in the center to do to reflect more the Jesuit values and these things that you've all been discussing in ways that are not just going to be palatable to people, but are actually going to be, they're able to act on them and to make them real. Because one of the things I was also thinking about is that people know what to do. They know what the right answer is. The question becomes, how do you do it? And so, which is why I like, Father Dorian, you're bringing up virtue ethics, because, you know, how do you give people the courage to do that? So my question then is, can you help me work with executives in Silicon Valley so that they can be, we can reflect more of our own mission? Thank you.
I'm going to cop out on that one and say the way to deal with the current situation is to invest in the undergraduate students. I think that the undergraduate students see themselves as leaders, and we should see them as leaders, and we should equip them with, and you know, whether it's a stipend for them to learn how to understand homelessness, so that when they get into a corporation, they can then they can promote this company, the company that I work in. I want you to do more on homelessness, and I want you to have some type of activities to do this. So I think that, I think importantly, I think we need to really do more and invest more in our undergraduate business students, because they, like you said, everybody has a leader to play no matter what role in the company that you're in. And companies today are looking for talented, and they care what the new crop of students view on the environment, view on corporate social responsibility, and things like that.
And it used to be that we would have the spirituality and organizational leadership course for our executive MBA cohorts. And I've seen over time a larger hunger for these types of topics. We can offer that. We have talent on campus that can speak to these issues for the Silicon Valley Executive Center. And I guess for you, it's a matter of determining what those are, what it is that they want from us as a home. So we offer a lot of different programs for our executive teaching. What do you want? We'll figure out a way to do it, I think, is kind of the ethos that we use at Santa Clara, is we will figure out a way to help whoever we can.
I wonder if also, there's a question, we talked about time and reflection, and Sarita, you talked about the way that mindfulness is now packaged as an app.
Literally.
Yeah, I don't think, one of the most frenzied students I ever taught is now a major marketing manager for Calm. But I do wonder, and it may be that certain things just aren't transmittable. The format itself, if you have people who are coming to you for 5 sessions, it may be that that Ignatian worldview, the Jesuit values, whatever we call it, maybe you can't package it in five sessions. It just may not fit into that. It just may require more time, and a greater openness to that. So I would worry about the potential commodification of this, because you're really talking about human formation. We are complex, and we take time to mature, and particularly when we're learning new things, which actually change our sense of self. Yeah.
So I have a crazy idea, and I don't know if you have any type of immersive part in terms of Thriving Neighbors, or there's so many partners. But I suggest that they spend the night in St. James Park and live for a day on $1, and wear clothes that are ragged and try to get along. I think that would have quite the impact.
I'd love to see you market that.
I'm trying, but I'm not a business person.
Yeah.
So I am in the MBA program, and I also work in the Ignatian Center, and I'm about halfway through the program. And my reflection so far is you would not know that we were at a Jesuit university unless you were actively looking for that. It was, I think, maybe casually mentioned in the orientation and almost as an apology, sort of an afterthought. Oh yeah, we're at Jesuit University. And through the classes, I think it's only been maybe mentioned once by a professor. I know that the spirituality and leadership course has been offered, but that's only been offered on Saturdays. And so in terms of accessibility, because it's not integrated in a concrete, very noticeable way, you'd have to sort of seek it out. And so I wonder if it'd be really possible to go through the program and get a very strong Jesuit MBA without knowing that. That is actually infused with some Jesuit values. And so I wonder if you find it valuable or important for the fact that we're at a Jesuit university to be explicitly named and to be discussed as to how that looks different than an MBA from Stanford or San Jose State University. Because I'm not sure that my cohort or my classmates would know that they were getting a Jesuit MBA.
So from the faculty standpoint, it's too bad that you don't know, because it's embedded in everything we do. And maybe it's the silence that is not being heard, the undercurrent, because we design courses and curriculum with the Jesuit mission in mind. And I'm not sure how things are marketed, so I apologize. But it is definitely part of who we are as an institution and even as an MBA. We do think about very deeply, even in our accreditation, how are we distinct? How are we Jesuit? How are we adding value to an MBA beyond just being an MBA? We are not just any MBA. How that's perceived, though, I have no idea. So I'm not in the marketing part. So it is there, and maybe it needs to be a bigger presence, but it's definitely part of our DNA.
So I'm thinking here, thank you, Charles, for being there and asking that intelligent question. If you enroll currently at Santa Clara as an undergraduate, I think the view book, it's called, it's designed for 17-year-olds. And it's largely a lot of pictures. And it's, I think, about 30 pages long. It's page 17 into the book before you find the word Jesuit written into it. And it's not explained. Why? Because it is marketed at 17-year-olds who maybe come from a very religiously diverse background. I think that's actually probably the right decision. I'm told anecdotally, Jennifer, and this is, is this getting broadcast somewhere? So, okay, all right, so I'm not going to say what I was going to say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, I guess in the question, so let me pose it as a question for those of us who are in marketing for different parts of the university. Do we lead with the word Jesuit in it? Where do we bring that into that, about that distinctive? So the second general of the Society of Jesus, a man called Father Lainez, came up with the phrase, as Jesuit education, we go into our students' doors in order to bring them out through ours. So somewhere along the way, which means that you don't necessarily need to lead explicitly with these things, but you do need to make sure that somehow that people are affected and changed and transformed by that as well. So I think in that way, it's a question of tactics about the strategy. I would argue, maybe this is a bit theoretical, but I think implicit values are good, but we also could make them more explicit as well. And one of the great challenges in a complex organization like ours is we have very many moving parts, and a university is a bit like a federation, and or a conglomeration of states, and that quite often we discover that somebody else is doing something we knew nothing about, or they're doing it in a very different way, or indeed our terminology is so fluid and loose. So if you ask people, what does it mean? What's a bronco? Give me 5 characteristics of a bronco or a bronchex. You would come up with a very different, different list as well. So I think I would say as the university, and I'd say as the mission and identity guy, we have some work to do in articulating these things in a more meaningful way, and particularly to get beyond our usual jargon and to get actually the real human meaning of these things, why these things matter, and why I'm convinced that our education is different. I think we have some work to do about explaining that better.
I think two things can be true. I think in terms of the institution, I think I definitely agree with Jennifer in terms of the Jesuit piece is embedded and also and explicitly, and marketing too as well. I think what the missing part is in the classroom. Is in terms of the classroom, the Jesuit education doesn't get into the business school like it should. So on the institutional level, the top leaders realize that I need to be explicit with Jesuit, but in the classroom, I'm not sure if it gets all the way in there. So I see the difference between institutions and in the classroom.
I think we want to be careful about that since we're not in the classrooms. Because I know some people take it very seriously. And some of our students are definitely impacted on a per class level. So I would love to get more feedback, but that's something that may be an area of growth. Definitely an area of growth for us.
I was just saying, my name is Nancy, and I'm a marketing center. In my experience in taking the Ignatian traditions, students who are doing in very limited means, but more often to businesses, is that they're really interested in the story of the Jesuits and the values, and so, but part of leadership is offering people something positive and hopeful to shoot for. So rather than saying, either giving up or saying, gosh, I wish we could go back to the way the Valley was, the Valley is the way it is. And both here in Silicon Valley and then at a CEO conference in New York, I just started with the story of the Jesuits themselves, how they formed. They were the original company. I used a lot of Chris Lowney's retelling of it from rural leadership. And people love it. And they can express that right there. They will say, oh, I never understood that was a Jesuit perspective. Often I use St. Ignatius instead of Jesuit because it puts it in feeling. And I talk about, I think I inspired with sort of 6 things that St. Ignatius offers us around leadership. And it is explicit, and it needs to be made explicit for people. But the other things you were talking about, Father Dorian, about innovation and inventiveness, those really those are very much the approach of Jesuits over the years.
Yeah.
And that it really does resonate here.
Yeah.
So I think there is, and I do think businesses can see in the interns that we send out there. Tom Plant wrote a great piece about his neighbor, the CEO, Silicon Valley CEO, who said, another university, fine university here in the Valley, those students show up to my company and they want to know, what can I do for them? And Santa Clara students show up in my company and they want to know what they can do for me and for the company. So I do think it is there, and we just need to be more hopeful, forward-looking, and explicit about it, and tell the story.
That's great to hear that because so I did the wedding last year of a couple, and the gentleman who married was a civil engineering graduate from here, and I asked him precisely this conversation. What's the difference between people who graduate from civil engineering here and they do from, say, Stanford? His comment was really interesting. He said that first of all, that business leaders recognize the human skills. That actually just the interpersonal relation skills are there, but it's also, he said something about the willingness to learn, and as things evolve 5 years down the road, your field is not going to look like it is now. So instead of having it all packaged, he said that Santa Clara engineering students have the reputation that they learn on the job. They may arrive with less skills than other people when they arrive, but they're humble enough, I think, in that to learn well. And that in itself, I think, is tremendously attractive value.
Thank you. I teach in the School of Engineering, but I don't teach engineering. I teach innovation theology and innovation is design and spirituality at the graduate level. So there's some things going on in the engineering school. My question to any of you on the panel, or all of you, we talk a lot, the phrase Jesuit values is used a lot. So whatever we mean by that and going deeper is part of this question, but it seems the reason for that question is not just get specific. It's a belief I have because business is all about value. And if they don't produce value, if they're in a competitive context, they die. So there is exchange value, which neoclassical economists focus on. Transaction value would be another word for it. It's what markets do and move. We can call it the financial economy. And then there's something called the real economy, or instrumental value, and then there's intrinsic value. And I think what we mean by Jesuit values is we're pointing to intrinsic value. But I'm wondering if you could comment, does the Jesuits' value show up in instrumental value as well as transactional or exchange value?
I'm extremely dubious lately about the use of the phrase Jesuit values, because I think it's philosophically it comes out of from a certain point, and I actually don't like it, and I don't use the phrase Jesuit values, and if I can possibly use that. I will use the phrase Jesuit characteristics, and I will use Jesuit virtues. But the question of values, I think, is a little fuzzy around the edges. So, I mean, I often, if you ask a cross-section of undergraduate students here, or indeed faculty or staff, what are Jesuit values, I don't think we'd come up with a particularly cogent list, nor would they be able to make the distinction that you make between those. So for me, this speaks to again, work that we have to do in actually more clearly articulating what is the nature, what does it mean to be this Jesuit Catholic university in this time and in this place? And what is the positive contribution that we can make to the common good, to the welfare of society?
So to follow up on that, Dorian, is there a mechanism in the university where that happens?
No.
Should happen?
Well, there isn't at the moment.
So it's not going to happen?
Yeah, well, nobody owns the responsibility. It doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, but currently, there is no committee for defining Jesuit values. I think Father Brian is moving us in that direction. Yeah.
At the same time, these are questions that we do approach in business leadership, in say entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, the Miller Center, many initiatives that we have on campus that we do look at these types of questions. In my own research, I've looked at beyond economic value, what are the other characteristics of value that businesses actually attend to? And in terms of social entrepreneurship, it's the application of a business model to actually overcome or at least attend to societal needs. How that's defined is not necessarily economic, and there are thousands of ways that you can actually create value that's not about the profit, about the individual dollar sign. And that's something that we discuss in the entrepreneurship courses, in the innovation courses, because it is relevant to everybody. And whether or not they are entrepreneurs or taking their first job, how they add value and how the business, whatever type of organization it is, adds value beyond the profit is actually something that's important to people at an individual heart scale. They want to be at a successful company, but they care about what values they are actually helping enable. And so it is something that we do attend to. I don't know if they do that in the engineering school, but it is core to the Jesuit values, however they're defined, or Jesuit characteristics, because it's important to the person as a whole. There was another question or two back in the back.
I guess I don't come as a critic. I'm 91 years old, and I first came to the Silicon Valley back in 1942 when there were 75,000 people in San Jose. And I want to address the first of my issues to the woman on the right here. Do you know anything about the late Bishop Frank Quinn and his sleeping on the streets of San Francisco in 1968? He slept on the streets for 4 nights to see what the homeless problem was. And as the Bishop of Sacramento, he was instrumental in getting the city fathers into the transfer of the Travis Air Force Base into a magnificent rehabilitation center. I would recommend that you get some information on that. You don't have to go down to St. James Park, but...
No, that's a beautiful story, and certainly right now what inspires me is bishops at the border when ICE is dumping immigrants, or I'm from Texas, so not a parallel story. I did not know this one, so thank you for that. I will look it up.
The other, I refer to the man over here with the Jesuit type of things. I'm Jesuit schooled. I have a master's degree in psychology from USF, and we have 7 lawyers in our family out of USF. And the last football kicker on the Santa Clara football teams before they became defunct was a McMahon from Butte, Montana, and he's my first cousin. So I'm a Santa Clara man at heart. Okay, basically, I'm disappointed in the sense that I don't hear the things, nothing of Vatican II and the Jesuit values. I mean, everybody got upset. I mean, everybody got turned upside down, and you've got a Jesuit Pope that he's willing to say, who am I to judge? And the famous picture, he's like David Thinker, watching a group of people, listening to them. And I think, I guess this is the thing that you're speaking about excelling. How do you excel when we're all on the bottom rungs of the ladder? We haven't even got to first base yet. And I'm not trying to be critical of you. It is a most difficult experience. You know, we're fighting for a church to stay alive, for heaven's sake, and so forth. I'm all for what you're doing, but at the same time, are you looking at the past, the history of what has already been done?
Can I jump in there? Thank you. Because there's one lady unconscious in front of the Institute. So when I was talking about the importance of looking at the past, I would say yes, I think we do. But we're also future focused as well. The past gives us our path towards the future. But as an educational business, where our investment is in the students, so it's important to know that history. It's important to know the global context as well. But yes, thank you, ma'am.
Hi, so I don't know if this is so much a question as an I wonder statement, but one of the things that I'm in love with in the Ignatian model is how it gifts me a gaze that is not immediately my own. So where I might see scarcity, I'm invited by St. Ignatius and the sacred to consider that perhaps the fruit has not been born because the seed is still underground. So when I sit and I practice the examen, I'm asked not to pit consolation and desolation against each other. There's no competition here. There's 2 movements that I'm asked to listen to. And I'm asked to imagine beyond my own vision and to take on God's gaze as much as I possibly can. And so even when the road seems to be ending, perhaps it's just turning. So I'm wondering in this Ignatian model with business, is there an opportunity to create some companioning or some partnering with executives who are developing their own friendship, it sounds like, not only with themselves, but perhaps with the world? Are there spiritual directors who can sit with an executive and not just say, you had an immersive experience, but how is it with your soul now that you have had an immersive experience. Because in my experience, I may not have time for reflection, but my soul is not going to shut up. If it is discontented or contented, it will rattle within me until I pay attention, and it will get louder until I do. But without the priests and the women's groups and the friends that have come alongside me in my life, I wouldn't have this capacity to listen, which is still growing. So that's my I wonder statement. Do we have companionable listening at all levels in this institution?
It's a Sarita type question.
Well, so I think it's here, but you have to look for it. But I have to say, Rob, first I thought, there's your there's your answer. You should speak with this woman after we close. So I actually do not feel qualified to fully answer your question, but I think that there are opportunities. There are pockets where this can happen. The Ignatian Faculty Forum has been mentioned multiple times. And so there are ways for that to happen. But again, I think personally, this is my personal view, that because there is not, or at least it appears to me, there's no time carved out for that we will pay you for this, or we will, that 1 hour of the Mass of the Holy Spirit type of thing, that everyone, I think, has good intentions and could seek it out, but gets overwhelmed, or this is what I see in people who come to me, and then I get overwhelmed. And so I'll stop there.
I guess maybe I respond to that, both as a spiritual director myself and somebody who's, both administrator and faculty at the same time. But I guess the thing is what's the purpose of a university is the question that brings up, and who is our primary audience? And I would say it's our students. So with all respect, that I think executive is one more ingredient that we could do. But we could have a university without executive education. We couldn't have a university without undergraduates and graduate students. So it's a question in terms of resources, and then where do we concentrate our resources, and where do we not duplicate, in the sense that we're not a retreat center. There are retreat centers in the area. But I would say, in contact with you, and your comments about the soul is really important. What I would say this is where it may be antithetical to the word. A CEO generally does not have time hardly to speak to their family, let alone, because and when your time, when you need to make your figures by the end of the quarter, there isn't much time for contemplation. It may be then that retired, people are out. The age and stage might be appropriate for that. But institutionally, I'm finding it hard to imagine that there would be, that we could make that. Much as I think it's a beautiful idea to give it, as a priority. Yeah.
Last question.
Fantastic. When I think of Disney, I think of Steve Jobs. And he had a really nice saying. The most powerful person in the world is a storyteller.
Yeah.
We had a bunch of stories here. That was real. So, but transparency is what Father O'Brien was talking about. He was talking about principle-based, transparent leadership.
Yeah.
How do you see a more transparent Santa Clara becoming?
Well, that's a good question.
Not that it's bad.
I think that's above my pay grade. I think that's a great question, fantastic question, but that's coming from Father O'Brien. That's something that the administration will really have to tackle first. I have a sense that faculty and staff would definitely appreciate it, and it does have to be both bottom up and top down.
I think any organization that functions well needs good communication, but in both directions. So telling people what is happening and why it's happening, and not allow. It avoids an awful lot of misunderstandings that way. But yeah, I mean, I would say that appropriately, that's certainly a goal to aim for. You know, our Catholic moral tradition is like Italian traffic lights, which is, you know, the difference. So Anglo-Saxon law is based on the fact that you must have law, you have laws, and then you have to obey them, but you have the minimum amount of laws. Roman law is based on the idea that you aim towards the ideal. So what's an Italian traffic light? It's a suggestion. So that's, I think. So the question within the Ignatian tradition, the code word is magis, which really means more authentic, more intimate. It's not about doing more. So if we are pointing in the right direction, that's good enough.
So I was on the campus climate committee, and we had the campus climate, so much work done in order to try to anonymously take the pulse of the university at all levels and across all units. And so I think that that is part of the effort of making things more transparent. And it's slow and it's bumpy and it's definitely not perfect, but I think it is a goodwill gesture towards this transparency. I think that an area of transparency that I would like to see is to focus on solidarity with the vulnerable on our own campus as much as focusing on solidarity with the vulnerable off campus. That part, I think, is not very transparent right now, and this is my anecdotal personal view. And so I think that that is an area of growth for the transparency on our campus.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm going to close our panel now, and I want to provide a thank you to our panelists, and thank you all for coming again. Thank you for being here and for such a fantastic conversation.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer.